To their family and friends, Mark and Sophia epitomized the ideal power couple. Their dynamic careers seemed to perfectly complement each other, he as a high-powered corporate lawyer and she as the marketing executive for a thriving tech startup. Photos of the two of them at galas and fundraisers painted a picture of unified success, with radiant smiles and attractive figures adorned in designer fashions. They effortlessly maintained a lifestyle that others could only envy and aspire to. However, it went beyond just career achievements and material trappings that made them the objects of admiration. There was a magical spark between Mark and Sophia that drew people to them like moths to a flame. When they walked into a room together, the air practically shimmered with an electricity, a crackling charge of energy and passion. The way they gazed into each other's eyes and lingered on every touch revealed a depth of intimacy and connection that most couples spend lifetimes trying to cultivate. They simply belonged together. Now there's a couple who has it all: brains, beauty, and a love that's going to withstand anything this crazy world throws at them. People would whisper in hushed tones of reverence. With fairy tale romance and storybook prosperity, Mark and Sophia were the avatars that everybody measured their own relationships and ambitions against. Unbeknownst to their admiring audiences, however, that lights were soon about to shatter the stained glass illusion into a million pieces. It began as one of those evenings that should have been utterly unremarkable. Mark had returned home a day earlier than expected from a business trip in Chicago. A missed flight connection meant he could surprise Sophia tonight rather than tomorrow. As he pulled into the driveway, soft lamplight from the bedroom window beckoned him inside with promises of his wife's warm embrace. Little did Mark know that he was about to step through the looking glass into a nightmare from which he would never fully awake. As Mark quietly opened the bedroom door, a viscous shock lanced through his body like a lightning strike. There, tangled among the sheets that had cradled their lovemaking countless times before, was his beloved Sophia and his best friend Jason. Their naked, sweat-slicked forms undulated in rhythmic ecstasy, oblivious to Mark's gaze boring straight through them. An anguished cry of disbelief escaped his lips as he stood frozen, unable to process the unimaginable betrayal unfolding before him. Everything after existed in Mark's memory as a nightmarish blur. Jason scrambling for his clothes as Sophia clutched the bedsheets to her heaving chest, desperate apologies and deflections falling on Mark's deafened ears. In that soul-shattering moment, he knew his life as he had known it was over. The idyllic existence he took for granted had revealed itself as a sham, a crumbling facade. And the two people whose intimate bond he treasured more than life itself had willingly, callously, demolished it in pursuit of their own carnal gratification. The days and weeks following the betrayal passed in a hazy torment for Mark. His world had been shattered into a million jagged shards that sliced at his heart with every breath. Divorce proceedings were quickly initiated, but the legalities of dissolving his marital bonds with Sophia felt utterly insignificant. Her careless infidelity hadn't just violated their sacred vows, it had detonated an emotional nuclear blast, leaving Mark's once vibrant life a smoldering, irradiated wasteland. As the rawness of Sophia's deception began to calcify into something harder and more insidious, a newfound rage took root, its crimson tendrils tightening their grip on his psyche. What type of paltry justice could a court ruling provide when it came to such a cosmic transgression? The idea that Sophia and Jason would simply be allowed to move on with their lives, as if nothing had happened, was unconscionable. No, they deserved to have their worlds erased as completely and mercilessly as they had obliterated his own Edenic existence. Mark's torment gestated and festered over the ensuing weeks, giving birth to an all-consuming obsession. He began meticulously constructing a master plan to annihilate every aspect of their lives, financially, socially, psychologically. With each component slotting into place, Mark could feel himself being consumed by a vengeful hunger that could never be sated through mere words or actions. He would become an artist of devastation, and the blank canvas upon which he would etch his masterpiece would be the shattered, hollow remnants of the treacherous souls who betrayed him. The divorce proceedings were little more than a perfunctory formality to Mark. As the judge's gavel fell with an empty thud, granting him legal freedom from the shackles of his marital vows, there was no sense of catharsis or closure. His world remained a gaping void, raw and unhealed, the visceral anguish of Sophia's betrayal still echoing through the halls of his once blissful existence, like the ghostly reverberations of a deafening explosion. How could a sterile court judgment begin to make penance for the wanton desecration of the most sacred human bonds? As Mark watched his soon-to-be ex-wife exit the courthouse, her porcelain facade betraying no hint of remorse, a smoldering ember of rage burst into an all-consuming inferno within his soul. In that moment, he knew mere dissolution of their marital ties could never serve as sufficient recompense. Like a phoenix reborn in flames of vengeance, Mark vowed to reduce every aspect of Sophia and Jason's lives to smoldering ash and ruin. His quest would become an all-consuming obsession, a single-minded pursuit from which there could be no relenting until the scales of justice had been devastatingly balanced. They would understand the exquisite torture of having one's world unmade, just as Mark's had been so brutally deconstructed. No corner of their existence would go unspoiled, no facet of their former lives untainted by his furious reprisal. Only when they had been laid psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually bare, broken down to their most primal, quivering states, could Mark finally begin to heal the depths of his own lacerated being. With a chilling sense of purpose, Mark began setting his intricate revenge plot into motion. First, he would dismantle the delusional facade behind which Sophia and Jason had been hiding their sordid tryst. A handful of damning photos and incriminating text exchanges were anonymously disseminated to their families, friends, and coworkers, ensuring the ugly truth of their indiscretions was laid bare. Let them be consumed by the shame and embarrassment they so richly deserved as their reputations crumbled to ash. Next, Mark turned his sights to the economic pillars propping up their comfortable existences. With ruthless precision and dispassionate calculation, he systematically drained their bank accounts, investment funds, and any other remaining assets until not a dollar could be accounted for. But draining their coffers proved merely the opening salvo. By meticulously creating a labyrinth of falsified loans, frivolous purchases, and other financial chicanery, all tied back to their names, Mark ensured his traitorous targets would soon be swallowing a tidal wave of immense debt. With their finances now hopelessly compromised, Mark's gaze fell upon Jason, the very man who had once been his closest confidant. Turning those old fraternal bonds against him, Mark leveraged personal and professional contacts to set into motion a slow-burning professional ruination for his ex-friend. Humiliating revelations about Jason's workplace conduct were strategically leaked. False accusations of impropriety and malfeasance began chipping away at his standing until a hammer finally fell. Termination from his high-paying corporate position, ensuring total financial devastation. Sophia's world was already crumbling around her, the rubble of her shattered life strewn about in smoldering heaps. But Mark was far from satiated in his quest for vengeance. There was one remaining jewel in Sophia's tarnished crown that he coveted above all else, her status as a mother. With surgical precision, he began laying the groundwork to separate her from the sole source of light, still flickering amidst the gathering darkness. Unbeknownst to Sophia, Mark had been diligently compiling an insidious dossier detailing the reckless instability that had crept into her life following the revelation of her infidelity. Surreptitious recordings captured her parading a ceaseless stream of casual flings through their family home, her once maternal compassion corroded by a jaded pursuit of fleeting pleasures. Each damning instance was meticulously documented, compiled into a devastatingly comprehensive indictment of her precipitous descent into unfit parenting. When the custody hearing finally arrived, the judge's face turned ashen as the full extent of the evidence against Sophia was dispassionately unleashed. Tearful pleas and desperate deflections effortlessly batted aside by the prosecutorial zeal of Mark's attorneys. In the end, Sophia was helpless to stop the inevitable judgment, stripping her of custodial rights over her beloved son David. As reality caved in around her, the broken mother could only watch in mute horror as her fragile remnants of hope were shattered once and for all. The cheap apartment reeked of desperation and shattered dreams, a purgatorial holding cell for the hollow, unstable specters Sophia and Jason had become. Stripped of her maternal rights and exiled from the trappings of her once enviable life, Sophia existed in a perpetual daze, each day blurring into an amorphous haze of anguish and self-loathing. In Jason, she found a kindred spirit equally adrift in the smoldering wake of Mark's scorched earth vengeance. The former lovers now bound by shared cataclysmic ruin, their relationship had mutated into something toxic yet compulsive. Stolen moments of frantic, almost bestial intimacy provided fleeting escapism from their harsh realities. But afterwards, the ugly truth would come crashing back in, two broken souls clawing at each other in the darkness, desperate for shelter in the storm of their own making. On her worst nights, racked by convulsive sobs as loneliness choked her from the inside, Sophia's thoughts would drift to David, her beloved son now permanently severed from her grasp. Visions of his cherubic smile and infectious laughter would haunt her, delayed anguish battering her psyche like sadistic aftershocks. In those bleakest moments, the temptation to simply fade into non-existence began whispering its seductive propositions into the void, rapidly consuming her will to persevere. Just when Sophia reached the nadir of her despair, convinced that the ashes of her once vibrant life could never be reforged, Mark would appear like a twisted specter. With a tenderness that felt like a blade tracing her exposed nerves, he would suggestion that perhaps, just maybe, their family could be made whole again. He'd reminisce about happier times, submerging Sophia in a wellspring of delirious hope that reconciliation was possible. It was all an expertly crafted ruse, of course, designed to erect towering emotional scaffolding for no other purpose than to relish in its catastrophic demolition. Once Sophia had scaled those vertiginous heights of anticipated reunification, clearly reconstructing every joyous nuance of their former marital bliss, Mark would pull the rug out from beneath. His demeanor would shift in an instant as his voice took on a reeved, hollow timbre, each subsequent syllable a plank of cruelty clobbering Sophia's fragile expectations. Even young David seemed to become an unwitting pawn in Mark's psychological warfare. With heartrending innocence, the boy would inquire when Mommy was finally coming home, his sweet hazel eyes reflecting total oblivion to the hellscape unfolding around him. Those dagger-tipped lances of hope penetrated deep, ensuring Sophia's torment remained an exquisitely open wound, never permitted to scab over into even the barest semblance of healing. The cycles of torturous hope and derision seemed to stretch towards an indefinite horizon for Sophia. Just when her battered psyche could endure no more anguish, Mark would initiate a new series of calculated mind games to erode what little resolve she had managed to cling to. Romantic overtures with no substance, scattered rose petals, candlelit dinners, whispers of reigniting their long-extinguished passion, gave fleeting sparks of life in Sophia's deadened soul. But like malicious clockwork, those ephemeral upswellings of warmth would be instantly doused by a deluge of Mark's impassioned fury. Vicious diatribes cascaded over her, each scathing phrase chipping away at the fragile defenses she so desperately tried to maintain. "You're a wretched whore undeserving of love," he'd snarl, overriding her pleas for mercy like a juggernaut. "Did you really think I could ever forgive your repulsive transgressions? On the verbal lashings persisted until Sophia simply crumpled to the ground, a trembling, diminished heap of shuddering sobs. It was all part of Mark's precisely engineered regimen to systematically dismantle her spirit through alternating psychological torments. Shards of elation were allowed to germinate only to be pulverized into a fine, chalky dust at their apex. With each passing cycle of ecstasy and evisceration, Sophia felt her sense of self becoming more tenuous, like a sandcastle being beaten by the unrelenting tides of his torment. Hollowed out from the inside, it was only a matter of time before the once vibrant woman was reduced to a fragile, ghostly wisp, the perfect canvas upon which Mark could inscribe the finality of her oblivion. As the final amber embers of Sophia's spirit flickered and died, Mark could feel the insatiable beast of his obsession finally being sated. This was more than just ruining her world. It was a complete and utter unmaking, a scorched earth campaign that left no aspect of her former life untouched. The radiant, vivacious woman who had once been his wife was now an hollow, shuddering specter, her essence systematically bled out through the myriad lashes his merciless onslaught. With a cold, clinical detachment, Mark surveyed the smoldering wreckage of what remained. Sophia's career, her finances, her relationships, her dignity as a mother, all of it unceremoniously incinerated until the very concept of who she once was existed only as ephemeral ash dispersing in the winds of his rage. This was the true face of vengeance, not mere desecration, but the utter eradication of every facet that composed her being. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, an icy calmness washed over Mark's soul as he drank in the delicious fruits of his labor. The collateral damage of his own life, having been laid to waste, felt like a mere trifle when measured against the haunting, beautiful nothingness to which he had reduced his traitorous former spouse. This was the pinnacle, the unshakable zenith of retribution he had spilled so much of his vitality to ascend. As a cruel smile played across his lips, one phrase echoed through Mark's mind like a euphoric mantra: revenge achieved. As Mark basked in the finality of his retribution, a fleeting moment of clarity pierced the hardened carapace around his heart. In achieving this long-sought-after obliteration of Sophia's life force, he was also forced to confront the inescapable truth that his own former existence now lay in smoldering ruins as well. The man he had been before that fateful night of betrayal, successful, confident in rapturous marital bliss, had been executed by the same poisoned katana he wielded against his spouse. Yet in glimpsing the guttered husk Sophia had become, denied even the cold comforts of rock bottom by Mark's systematic dismantling of her societal footings, he sensed the sacrifices constituted a justifiable exchange. His world had been rent asunder, but from those ashes he had conducted an intricately orchestrated immolation of his traitorous wife's very essence. Careers could be rebuilt, assets replenished, but reducing someone's spirit to a tremulous tableau of charred desolation, that was an heirloom to be coveted for eternities. As Mark turned away from the desecrated specter that had once been the effervescent light of his cosmos, he felt an eerie serenity envelop him. Yes, there had been a degree of mutually assured destruction in this meticulously executed vengeance ballet. But in that moment, the void that had been evacuated from Sophia's soul represented the ultimate trophy, a vanquished will that he could effortlessly grasp and crush at his whim. This was more than some scorched earth obliteration of her previous identity. It was the scorching of her very humanity into smoldering cinders perpetually at his mercy. In the aftermath of Mark's grand opus of vengeful destruction, it was Sophia who now resided at the epicenter of the detonated life they once shared. No longer a woman, but a haunted revenant condemned to wander the scorched remains in a perpetual daze. Each rattling inhalation felt like breathing shards of nuclear fallout, as the very air she consumed corroded her withering existence. Where vivacious laughter and joy had once reigned, only suffocating silence dwelled, punctuated by the occasional subterranean tremor of Sophia's episodic lapses into inconsolable despair. In those moments, the floodgates would burst as all the anguish Mark had so methodically layered atop her battered psyche came flooding out in racking paroxysms. Hitching sobs reverberated through the empty spaces once warmly occupied by dreams of a bright future. Now it was an endless purgatory of misery, hopelessness, and self-loathing. For Sophia, there could be no rising from these blighted ashes. Mark's systematic evisceration of her life force had been so thorough, so calculated, so maliciously persistent that any semblance of who she once was had been utterly annihilated. What remained was a fragile, translucent wisp, a raw nerve ending permanently exposed to the searing torments of the ruination he had constructed around her. A lost soul, wounded beyond the concept of healing, doomed to exist in perpetuity as a perpetual cautionary tale of what lay at the nadir of a man's bottomless thirst for retribution. As Mark watched the condemned specter that had once been his beloved wife recede into the smoldering distance, he couldn't help but feel a perverse surge of twisted satisfaction. This waking vision of desolation was his grand design, a masterwork of malice brought into lucid existence through sheer force of will. The fixation that had burrowed into his marrow from that first instant of betrayal was finally sated. Sophia was utterly unmade, a vacancy scarcely even qualifying as a human being. Yet, in allowing this all-consuming obsession to reach its ultimate apotheosis, what had been sacrificed along the way? Mark's recollections of who he had been prior to that fateful discovery felt like some half-remembered specter from a previous existence. The charismatic man who had once commanded respect and admiration from colleagues and friends remained, but as a hollow facsimile. Any tendril of lightness or genuine warmth that may have still fleetingly stirred had been systematically excavated until only an empty husk occupied by vengeance remained. As the dust began settling over the detritus of two extinguished souls, Mark came to a chilling realization smoldering at his core. He had achieved complete and total victory, becoming the consummate architect of his traitorous wife's demise. However, in giving such utterly devastating shape to his pursuit of retribution, he too had self-immolated into something irretrievably other. While Sophia was now a trembling vacant grotesquerie, Mark himself had become a hollowed-out monolith of bass machinations and spite in the name of cementing this acrid triumph. Two lives laid to waste on the profane altar of vindication, twin mannequins contorted in the rictus posture-death grimaces of their mutually assured undoing.